Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the human personality, its fragmentation, and its resilience. With me is Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a professor of psychiatry at the City University of New York and author of numerous books, including The Nazi Doctors, Death in Life, Survivors of Hiroshima, The Broken Connection on Death and Continuity, and The Protean Self. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. We're going to focus on your book, The Protean Self, and I think it's appropriate to begin by letting those who are listening and watching know what the word protean means. You're not referring to proteins.
Well, it all starts with Proteus. It's named after Proteus, the Greek sea god, who came out of the sea and was a notorious and talented shapeshifter. He could shift his shape into anything human, animal, natural, and wouldn't resume his original shape unless seized and chained. So I've seized upon Proteus as a metaphor for the contemporary self and the flux, changeability, malleability, and resilience that I think we have in our contemporary life.
It's interesting that you use the term resilience because there are a number of social critics who think that the human spirit is too malleable, too changing, and too fractured and fragmented in the postmodern age.
Well, some of our adaptability can get us into trouble. For instance, I've been very interested in and concerned about our capacity to adapt to evil, to adapt to evil environments and participate in them. But the kind of proteanism I write about has to do with extricating oneself from dead ends and a flexibility that's inherent in the human animal and which I think historical forces have further unleashed in the 20th century and especially at the end of the 20th century.
You've traveled all over the world, interviewing people, getting to know them at a psychiatric level, and have found many life stories of people who go through remarkable conversion experiences or changes.
You know, one of the things that surprises people is that I came to this idea while working in Japan with young Japanese. One doesn't think of the Japanese as especially protean because they can be very rigid and systematic, but I was interviewing students in their late teens or early 20s, this was back in the 60s, and they had been through emperor worship in certain cases, emperor worship, the American occupation, which they had embraced in many cases. They had taken an interest in traditional Japanese culture. Some had embraced Marxism. All within that 20 years, they'd gone through so many changes. Then finally, some would sit back, do a little drinking and relax and get themselves ready for the large corporations they would join if they came from a prominent enough university. And I began to ask myself whether this was not quite different from what I'd been taught in my psychiatric and psychoanalytic training, which said that, you know, the first 6 years of life determine almost everything, and there's not much significant change in adult life and so on. It all seemed wrong. And I began to think about what this means for Japanese, and then coming back to America, we naturally, the most protean of all, for lots of good historical reasons, and I began to think of it as a general principle. But it was from work in Japan that I came upon it.
Well, one of your specialties has been the influence of historical events on human personality, and we live in a time of great historical change.
Yes, and really, the concept of the Protean self wouldn't have any validity if it weren't anchored in historical events. And the historical forces that I think are important here are, first of all, the obvious one, the enormous dislocations that we have felt in the 20th century, not only through wars and upheavals and genocides and Holocaust, but simply the speed, the rapidity of historical change and the influence of technology. That's central. And then the mass media revolution, which is enormously important, because right now the mass media revolution renders virtually any event in any culture, past or present, available to virtually anyone at any moment. That is a revolutionary situation. And the third historical event is the what I call imagery of extinction, or the awareness we all have at some level that we could extinguish ourselves as a species with our own technology. So those historical forces set the stage for the emergence of the Protean self. It's from trauma that possibilities emerge.
Now, there are various elements of society and ideologies that seem opposed to this notion of, I'll call it flexibility.
There are indeed. At the other side of the coin, perhaps, is fundamentalism, which seeks an all or none belief system, a kind of absolute that doesn't move, that stays fixed. And I think one can say, broadly speaking, that fundamentalist-like movements, whether they're political or religious, are a reaction to the Proteanism of our century.
Well, what I found most fascinating were the interviews that you conducted with people who belong to fundamentalist groups, and what you discovered was an incredible paradox there, that although they resist this protean flexibility, it's almost de rigueur to have gone through some sort of striking conversion experience.
Well, what often happened with the fundamental, we interviewed a group of Christian fundamentalists who were involved in end-time ideology, that is, waiting for the end of history and the Battle of Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus, sometimes tied in with nuclear holocaust, bringing it about. But when we interviewed them carefully, they would often have had an experimental youth where they were quite protean, and then had some kind of conversion, and often they'd had a religious influence in the family in the past, a conversion into a fundamentalist belief system. But even while fundamentalists, while in that fundamentalist belief system, various protean tendencies would manifest themselves in different ways. For instance, they didn't necessarily accept the end-time ideology in any literal way as connected with nuclear weaponry as offered by some of their theologians, but they would question it. They would make up stories of their own. They would give different versions of it. So the general point here is that even among fundamentalists, there are certain protean tendencies.
Well, does that suggest to you that the social and cultural, the historical forces supporting this kind of inner flexibility are much greater than the forces that would be resisting it?
Well, it's hard to say that. It's as if there's a struggle in the world between the two. One could take the confrontation between Salman Rushdie and Ayatollah Khomeini as a kind of symbol, or as an exemplification of struggles throughout the world at many levels. The one, a protean writer and a man of two different cultures, which he had been immersed in, and highly protean, and the other, an arch fundamentalist. So I would say that the historical forces open us out into a protean tendency, and the fundamentalist response is a reaction of fear, seeking to close down that protean tendency and prevent that openness, which is seen as dangerous.
Well, many of the people who cry out against this sort of flexibility, they might call it permissiveness. They might say it's leading to social decay, to crime, too much social experimentation. It needs to be guided, that it's not enough simply to change and to move in any direction. There must be values. What about fundamental human values in all of this?
Well, absolutely. I try to explore this issue because Proteanism is not ever itself absolute. I tell this little incident when a couple of graduate students once came up to me in a typical New York style, said, "Hey Lifton, I tried being a Protean man, it doesn't work." What he meant was that he tried undergoing a series of changes and nothing but, and you can't live that way. And he was right. I realized he was saying something quite serious. You need some sort of balance between inner form, in a structure, a kind of stable area of your life that frees you to be more Protean in your experimentation or more experimental in your Proteanism, and you need some sort of combination. And part of the ongoing form or stability has to do with values and with some element of ethical center. We all seek an ethical center, and sometimes that can be elusive, but we require it. And Proteanism has difficulty finding it, but needs it, so that the Protean self isn't a definition of an ethical position of itself, but combines with some ethical tendency in that balance.
Yeah. Let's focus in on the word self. You use it, you could have said the Protean personality or Protean behavior or something. You talk about the self as if what we're discussing is fundamental to human identity.
Yes, I think it is fundamental to human identity, and I think the self is a good vantage point for looking at Proteanism because it's a way of summarizing the person. The way that I define the self is one's inclusive symbol of one's own being or one's own organism. And it's this that we now build from bits and pieces in this Protean fashion, and yet the surprising truth and the good news in my book is that for most of us it more or less works. So why not give it a name, look at it, and recognize that it's our modus vivendi of this era.
When you put it that way, it sounds rather like the existentialist idea that we create ourselves.
It has a lot of that, and over the course of my work I've been influenced by phenomenology and existentialism. And there is a real extent to which we create a sense of self, but much of it can be out of awareness, it can be unconscious, and things can happen that surprise us. We're never in completely rational control of the process.
Robert, you have looked at some of the most horrific events that have happened in modern human history. You've written about Hiroshima, about the Holocaust. You've really seen the darker side of human nature, and yet just being with you now, it's evident that you have an optimistic feeling about human possibility here. Can we talk about the promise that you see in Proteanism?
I would say first that in studying things like Nazi doctors or Hiroshima or Vietnam, the darker side of human experience, there was always not an optimism but a hopefulness in my work, and in each of those studies, each of the books I wrote about those matters, I ended up with reflecting on what this immersion into evil had meant and what the alternatives were, what one learns from it that can take one in a different direction. So there always was that hopeful side, but now here's this book that is about the hope itself. The whole book is really a description of a hopeful direction of the self as we're now forming it. It's not a guarantee of an optimistic human future, and I wouldn't even describe myself as optimistic, but rather as hopeful, which is really quite different. I guess that in looking at people that I've studied, I've observed changes they've undergone. For instance, in working with Vietnam veterans, anti-war veterans, I was struck by how some of them could change radically and open themselves to a critical view of their own war and war-making, change in relationship to women, in relationship to worldview, all within months or even weeks. Once they confronted what they had seen and done in Vietnam. And this was painful to look at for them and for me too, to an extent, but it was also very hopeful in relation to the issue of change and transformation. So I've seen it happen in relation to Holocaust, and now I've tried to delimit and define this kind of self that enables it to happen.
Well, does it seem to you that when we look into ourselves and we discover so much in the way of potentiality and possibility, and that it opens up deeper capacities for compassion, for intuition, for deeper insight?
I think it does, because Proteanism certainly holds out at least the possibility for wider empathy, and therefore compassion for other people. And I talk in my book about the very possible movement from the Protean self to what I call the species self. That is a nitty-gritty sense of oneself as a member of humankind, which means a potential identification with every other human being. And that's not just a wild, idealistic vision, but rather a nitty-gritty possibility that our media can now contribute to in many ways. And the Protean self does allow at least for that to happen with its openness.
Yeah. It sounds as if the ramifications of what you're talking about are really quite extraordinary. It strikes me as if you're suggesting that as people develop this kind of empathy, that what's breaking down are the traditional forms of socialization and the traditional ideologies and dogmas that have held people apart from each other.
The traditional dogmas and ideologies that have separated people are unfortunately not completely breaking down, but they're being looked at more critically by more and more people. And they're still all too active in the world in various forms of nationalism and various kinds of war making that are associated with nationalism. But more and more people see beyond them and recognize what I call very simply human commonality, what we have in common as human beings, and these are very fundamental qualities that we have in common, all human beings everywhere from very different cultures. And again, the very flexibility and many-sidedness of the Protean self helps one toward that broader identification with other human beings.
One of the things that you wrote about is that as people's selves change, their allegiance to ideas changes, that ideas have less of a hold on people.
Yes, and to put it even more radically, whereas in the past the problem has been how do you get people out from under dogmatic idea systems, and that's still a problem, it hasn't gone away. Now in many places, I can see this in my teaching, it's easy for students to develop ideas and to believe in them. What's more difficult is for them to sustain a belief in any idea system. So as the Proteanism expands and people question ideologies, they question idea systems in general, and that's why we develop eclectic tendencies in psychology and in many disciplines, because people have difficulty holding to belief systems. Even some of the postmodern directions, deconstruction is a way of getting underneath and deconstructing, as they say, idea systems and ideologies, and that's been a successful idea, that idea of deconstruction, because of the existence of this Protean tendency toward skepticism toward idea systems. Certainly the skepticism toward the broad ideologies of the 19th and 20th century, that skepticism is healthy and can only be helpful to humankind. Yet we still do need ideas and idea systems that people have to come to believe in.
And I suppose there's also a concern about such things as family values. In crime, one of the things that you use to document the Protean self and its existence is that there are so many relationships breaking up, so many divorces, so many people with multiple families.
You know, what's easily misunderstood is that the Protean self is a quest for form. It's a quest for a kind of stability.
Yes.
It isn't just a series of changes for their own sake that people undergo, and often they undergo Protean changes without thinking that they are, or without talking about it in that kind of language. But what we experience is that we're bequeathed certain religious beliefs, beliefs about authority or education or how we should live our lives, and they don't feel authentic. So we search for alternatives or for modifications of them. And that search, that quest, is for beliefs and people and ideas that we can believe in and hold to. But we remain protean because it's hard to find them, or hard to find structures that we can stay with. And in that sense, the protean concept is not separate from values. It seeks values all the time. And when it's functioning in its best form, what I call integrative proteanism, it's balanced with values and value systems, and also a balance between structure and quest.
It reminds me, as you're speaking, of perhaps Shakespeare as a model of the Protean self, somebody who could enter into the living reality of kings or beggars, men and women, that there's some kind of a higher consciousness associated with it, almost telepathic.
Yes. You know, one of my British friends and colleagues has written to me extensively about Shakespeare's Proteanism, and it's quite true. Proteanism of his imagination, in his being able to enter into, with extraordinary empathy, so many different kinds of minds, and in a way almost non-judgmentally, as he evoked evil or decency or mixed elements, almost beyond what one could imagine his experience to be. But that's, I think, an imaginative quality that's particularly human, and all the more so in the hands of genius.
So there is a sense that as we're going through these enormous cultural changes and disruptions, that the possibility of that kind of genius being at least a little more available to us.
Well, you know, whether genius or not, I depend in this book on contemporary novelists a great deal. Really, my two main sources are interviews and literature, and novelists like Saul Bellow or Don DeLillo or Salman Rushdie, or novelists now who are third world novelists becoming American, like Bharata Mukherjee. They are wonderful manifestations of Proteanism in what they write, what they say, and in their rendition of what they're doing. So, you know, DeLillo can write about some of the madnesses and contradictions in our society, and yet see hope and love as he has in his work, because he has a certain sympathy for these protean changes. Also Saul Bellow in an earlier generation. And Mukherjee sees America, as many immigrant groups have, as being outside, as she says, of God's vision, meaning you could do things that you couldn't do in the old world, and you could recreate yourself. And she asks, how many selves can I find? Wondering with great joy and a certain amount of fear about what it is to be an American. So it's from writers with their empathy and with their anticipating and reflecting what's happening in our society that one learns so much about Proteanism.
And the interviews that you conducted were across all spectrums of society as well, weren't they?
Yes, because in our Center on Violence and Human Survival that I'm director of at City University and John Jay College, we had 4 groups we were interviewing, and we had started interviewing them for an earlier study of nuclear threat in the American self. And the 4 groups were a group of social activists, a group of Christian fundamentalists, a group of civic leaders, and a group of black poor. Now, these are very divergent people in their backgrounds, but as I began to study them and interview them and look at other people's interviews, all 4 groups manifested enormous amounts of Proteanism. One might expect it, say, in the social activists, but less so in civic leaders, and even less in Christian fundamentalists, but they all had their manifestations of Proteanism in a very impressive fashion.
Now, you've used the term Proteanism quite a bit, and I know you're not thinking of it as a religion, but or even a philosophy, are you?
No, not really. I really mean it as a phenomenon, as
Yes.
a tendency. But I suppose that term has its risks, because as soon as you speak of an ism, even an ism about change and transformation,
Yes.
it has the danger of becoming rigidified and fixed. I don't mean it to be.
Yes, yes. As a theorist in the field of psychology and psychiatry, is Proteanism, I'll use it as an ism for the moment, does it fit into psychological theory as we understand it?
Well, you know, it fits into a tendency. It's a new theory of itself, and I hope everybody adopts it. They should, because it's true. But I think it fits in with a very important tendency that has been taking shape. I've been very influenced by the work of Erik Erikson on identity. And really, as he evolved identity theory, it was an effort to develop from Freudian psychoanalysis a freer idea of the individual person or individual. He didn't use the term self, but it amounted to something very close to that. And I learned, and also to bring history into our understanding of the formation of identity or of the human being, broadly speaking. And I see myself as carrying this kind of work further, in which there is still greater freedom, in my view, afforded the self, and greater change going on, which is still very much a product of human history, and particularly of recent history. And there are others, for instance, Heinz Kohut in psychoanalytic theory, writing about the self and also emphasizing multiplicity and changeability. So it does connect with certain developments in psychology and psychoanalysis, but it carries them perhaps into a more radical direction.
Well, it almost seems to me that if one were to think of any academic field that's fragmented, it is psychology. You've got the cognitive psychologists and the Freudians and the Jungians and the Adlerians.
So we should know what Proteanism is.
I mean, it's as if Proteanism is a metaphor for all of psychology in some sense, maybe a way of tying it all together.
Yes, well, psychology is really many different fields under one rubric of psychology, because some of laboratory psychology has little to do with psychoanalysis. And however, perhaps it's a good idea to keep this rubric and maybe see the field, as you say, I like your suggestion, as having its own protean tendencies, being many-sided, and all trying to understand how human beings are psychologically formed, what motivates their behavior, and what kind of behavior they or we are capable of.
Well, Robert J. Lifton, you seem to be suggesting that human beings are capable of things that we can hardly begin to imagine.
Well, that's what I hope to suggest. That's what I am suggesting. That's why this is a book that's very hopeful, more so than any book I've written. But it has to be understood it doesn't guarantee anything. Because I say we're protean, that doesn't guarantee a rosy future. What it does say is we have at least the capacity to create a different future.
Robert J. Lifton, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, I've enjoyed it.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.